Hey team, and welcome to another video in the Astrological Magical Elections video series. Unfortunately, for this time, we actually don't have any magical electional opportunities to share, just because the skies, kind of in general, hate us lately. So for those of you who've been kind of following this series for a little bit, the past few videos, we've talked a lot about the retrograde planets that have kind of plagued a lot of the electional opportunities that we've had to work with. And that's kind of that's basically the continued story. Is just that we're continuing to kind of struggle with the retrograde planets that are basically disqualifying signs from being on the ascendant, and are otherwise not able to be utilized, for like moon applications and those kinds of things. So during this 2-week period, we'll have Venus turn direct, which will put, of course, Taurus and Libra back on the spot for being able to be signs that we utilize either on the ascendant, and puts Venus as a planet we can use as lunar applications. But in sort of like the world's most amazing lateral move, Mercury will be turning retrograde during this time period as well. So we'll kind of trade in Taurus and Libra for Gemini and Virgo, as it were. So now those two signs we're not going to be able to utilize on the ascendant for a few weeks. And then Mercury will not be able to be a planet we can use as a lunar application. And so that continues to restrict us a lot. And a lot of times during this 2-week period, as I was working on electional opportunities, the ones that did end up looking good almost always had the moon applying to Jupiter, who's retrograde, and you can't really use that. So I just felt it was better to do, kind of nothing. But obviously, we're not going to literally do nothing. So because this time period is happening between, 3 eclipses, more or less, kind of 2 baby eclipses and one more real eclipse, we'll say, I thought it would be a good time to kind of talk about eclipses, their history, and why we try not to utilize them, especially in planetary magic, at all. So first we have to talk about, what is an eclipse? Why are eclipses bad? Kind of where did this whole thing get started? So eclipses occur anytime the sun or the moon come to a conjunction or opposition with one another within a certain proximity to the lunar nodes. So the lunar nodes are mathematical points that we as astrologers track that tell us the point of where the intersection between the moon's orbit and the sun's orbit intersect. So, even though we'll have full and new moons every month, we don't always have an eclipse every month because the sun and the moon are not exactly aligned with one another. They're, a little bit north or south of one another, and so they don't block out one another during, non-eclipse lunations. But at these points in time where they align themselves with the lunar nodes, with the points of the intersection between the sun and the moon, then we have that overlap. Then we have, in the lunar eclipses, where the moon is covered by the shadow of the earth, and then solar eclipses where the moon comes in between the earth and the sun. So all throughout astrological history, eclipses have been associated as kind of harbingers of doom, as it were. There's a real association with eclipses and, a lack of light, a cutting off of light, a severing of cycles, or otherwise are incomplete. In lunar eclipses, we have kind of this uncharacteristic blotting out of the moon's light when she's supposed to be at her fullest and most luminous. And then, of course, the sun is never supposed to go out, so that's never great when that happens. And so these themes of darkness, of cutting off of life, are ideas that get associated with eclipses and their astrological interpretations, especially if you're in a place where you can visibly see the eclipse, like suddenly it getting dark in the middle of the day, like that's not okay, what happened? And so this meaning gets applied to these eclipses astrologically. Because eclipses involve the sun and the moon, which are seen as like planetary royalty more or less, eclipses are usually related to heads of state. There's usually an association between the eclipses and some sort of political turmoil or uncertainty, and in sort of the more, we'll say, literal kind of on-the-nose significations, it has to do with like the death or the ending of a king or some head of state. And there are several instances where this has been recorded for us fairly well. Probably our oldest reference to eclipses and being associated with specifically negativity and the death of kings comes to us from Babylon with the ritual of the substitute king. Basically, the idea is that whenever the Babylonian astrologers would predict an eclipse, they would see it often as a threat to the king and his livelihood and, to the kingdom in general. And so what they would do is they would have a kind of this elaborate ritual where a temporary king would be elected, usually from the slave or prisoner class, while the real king and his family kind of, went off into hiding. And so this substitute king would then kind of, perform kingly duties or, whatever during the eclipse, kind of taking over the role of the king through the eclipse. And so the idea was that the eclipse would only really happen or matter to, the king in power, which is this fake king. Hereby, we're trying to outsmart the celestial omens, more or less. And while the timing of this is a little unclear, we're not sure kind of when this happened. Usually, the substitute king was killed, at the end of his reign, as to sort of force the celestial omen to happen, sort of on the people's own terms, or on the nation of Babylon's own terms. A little bit more recently in history, we have the eclipses in 840, which were said to portend the death of Louis the Pious, which happened just a couple of weeks after the eclipse occurred there. We also have documentation of an eclipse in 1135 that was visible from England, which actually occurred on the same day that the King of England, King Henry I, left to go to Normandy to fight in the First English Civil War. And while King Henry I passed away 2 years later, so not exactly super close to the eclipse, that was the last time that he was in England. So in a very real sense, that was the day that England lost its king. We have evidence of other high-ranking individuals who were fearful of eclipses. Pope Urban VIII is pretty famous for this because he actually had a prediction about his death being tied to an eclipse. And so during those eclipses, he actually kind of bunkered down in an anti-eclipse bunker to perform various astrological magical rituals to kind of petition the eclipses to not, kill him, which appears to have been successful. Something that is probably a bit more culturally relevant to a lot of us in the English-speaking world is the eclipse that is reported to have occurred during the crucifixion of Jesus. The Gospel writers Matthew and Mark's accounts of the crucifixion both tell of the sun going dark for a period of about 3 hours, from noon to 3. And while that is kind of a long time for a solar eclipse to happen, the totality of an eclipse usually only lasts for several minutes, and scholars have not been able to trace an eclipse that was visible to that area in kind of the years that we suspect to have occurred during the life of Jesus Christ himself. That's really not important. It's not that important that an actual real documented solar eclipse occurred during that time, because, on the one hand, you can always take the route of, it was a supernatural occurrence, which is totally fine, I'm down for, or, there's also the other one of just the symbolism involved. What is a way for the writers of this story to convey really the gravity of the situation, that the Son of God has been killed by, blotting out the actual sun in the sky for a period of time. That is something that the readers of the Bible during that time and, for several centuries after would really understand, as so far as the anxiety and the fear and the symbolism involved in having the sun darken at a time when, a very important person was killed. If you need another example of eclipses signifying fear, anxiety, disaster, and general troubles with heads of state, look no further than, the United States of America. In August 2017, we had the Great American Eclipse, which cut right through the middle of the United States of America. And, since then, things have been going great for the United States. It's fine here. Everything's fine. It's fine. Don't worry about it. Everything's peachy keen. It's great. It's good. Just look over there. So eclipses are obviously really dramatic spectacles for people to observe and to, be interested in. And it's not uncommon for the path of totality to see a lot of visitors, for people who, want to see it, who want to experience it. And I think that location-based aspect of eclipses is something that we don't really talk about enough in astrology today. Today it's very popular to see people say, there's an eclipse at this degree, so watch out. You expect things to happen in this area of the chart. And I'm not super convinced that eclipses really work that way. Historically, eclipses were almost entirely relegated to the realm of mundane astrology, that is, the astrology of world events, being used to predict natural disasters, or famine, or, the death of kings. And you don't really see their utilization into individual natal charts, except for the charts of heads of state. And this is something that I've kind of seen borne out in my own astrological practice and own experiences, where just because an eclipse happens, conjunct an important part of the natal chart, doesn't really mean that you can expect some kind of manifestation of that to occur. I think there are a lot of arguments you can make here for when that might be expected, but as somebody who had, an eclipse on the ascendant, and had their 19th birthday, their 19th solar return be during a solar eclipse, and it doesn't really have any, big memories of any kind of topsy-turvy turmoil events or anything like that happen, as well as, several stories that I've heard from other astrologers or that I've seen in case histories. You just don't really see it a lot. You don't see a lot of eclipse kind of things happening to people on a personal level. Of course, that doesn't mean that people can be more tied into whatever more general societal thing that the eclipse signifies. And that's, its own thing that I think is worth looking into. But just because, you have an eclipse in your 6th house or on your ascendant doesn't mean that you can expect, some kind of major health crisis, or, having an eclipse on your midheaven doesn't mean that you're going to lose your job or anything like that. It just doesn't really seem to work that way for people as individuals. It's much more something that mundane astrologers take into consideration. There's also the fact that eclipses are very location sensitive, very location based. Only specific locations in the world will actually get to witness an eclipse at any given time. So just because an eclipse happens, all over the world in the zodiac, that doesn't mean that the entirety of the world experiences eclipses in the same way. And it really seems that effects of an eclipse are focused in the areas of the world where the eclipse is visible, almost like, this line that goes through the world and is like, you guys, watch out. That's not to say that there are never instances when eclipse can't mean something significant in a natal chart. I think there's a real argument to be made that individuals who are going through, sun-profected years, they're probably going to be a bit sensitive to solar eclipses that happen during that year. Same thing for individuals who are going through moon-profected or ruled years and lunar eclipses. Like, that makes a lot of sense to say, hey, these eclipse periods are probably going to be important for you guys because of unique configurations with Time Lord activations and continuous horoscopy. But I don't think that everybody should be fearful or worried about eclipses all the time because, there are 2 to 3 a year. So what does any of this have to do with astrological magic? Why are we even talking about this? Well, for a lot of reasons, I guess. Talking about eclipses as being kind of spectacles that everybody wants to be involved in or wants to witness and see, this attitude has definitely become incorporated into the magical communities, especially in more New Age traditions, where eclipses are generally regarded as not as negative as they had been in the past. There's this real push to kind of reframe eclipses as being more positive, or at least more neutral than they have been historically, kind of trying to regard those more fearful or more negative aspects of eclipses as being like relics of the past. So in more New Age magical circles, eclipses are usually regarded as kind of supercharged lunations. They're seen as very significant times for individuals to do lunar or solar magic because of their increased potency. For lunar eclipses, the idea is that because the moon goes through all of her phases very quickly, it's useful for, a magician to kind of tap into that and kind of pick, what they need from that. So typically the lunar synodic cycle is, 29 and a half days, but during an eclipse it happens in, about 3 hours. So you have a lot of time to kind of tap into lunar energy and pull out whatever phase that you need, and then it's just kind of regarded as supercharged, as much more effective for whatever purpose you need it. But for me, as an astrologer who kind of pays a little bit more attention to celestial portents and symbolism, from its own tradition, I can't help but notice that this idea is true. If you have a lunar eclipse, the moon is full, and then she wanes back out to quote, new as the Earth's shadow covers her, and then she waxes back to full as the Earth's shadow recedes. So the idea is there, it's very true, I guess. But you'll notice that it actually happens the wrong way in an eclipse. So with lunar phases, the moon waxes and wanes right to left. That means that as the moon waxes, the right side of the moon gets the light first, and it kind of gradually increases to take over the left side. And then as she wanes, the darkness begins on the right until it engulfs the moon entirely. During lunar eclipses, this happens instead from left to right. And this is about as close as the moon can get to retrograde motion, since she's not able to actually experience it herself, as she always moves direct. And having the moon's phases happen backwards is not exactly what I would call an auspicious portent. Historically, the magic around eclipses has been very similar to their interpretations: wild, toxic, negative, destructive. And these are things that we continue to see with eclipse work today. Back when I used to frequent Reddit, I would often check out stories from our occult about individuals who had done eclipse magic, and just to kind of see the ways that it had kind of turned on them. Stories ranging from new individuals entering the person's life that ended up being toxic or stalkerish, to stories of new medical issues that cropped up shortly after the rituals. I used to actually have like a file on my computer full of the stories that I'd copied to, use whenever somebody tried to give me lip about how eclipse magic was fine or okay to do and not dangerous. But I've since deleted it. It doesn't feel like that's a good kind of energy to carry around with you. And those are just kind of like the highlights of some of the stories that I can remember. But the general theme of eclipse magic kind of being like the monkey's paw almost is very, very true. So if you're not supposed to use eclipses for, generally for magic, if you're not supposed to use them for generally constructive magic, and you don't want to use eclipses for, what they're used for destructive magic or cursing or anything like that, then what can you use them for? Well, really not a whole lot. I don't really recommend using eclipses for much of anything. In fact, the only thing that I could really kind of sign off on using eclipses for would be like cleansing and purging and those kinds of things. But there are other configurations that can do the same thing and will probably be easier, more helpful, and just generally more gentle to utilize in that kind of an operation than an eclipse, which is a little bit like warming up your pizza with a flamethrower. In the Yoda tradition, there are actually mantras that are utilized to kind of pacify the eclipse or to otherwise, have their effects pass over you unaffected to either Rahu or Ketu, depending on the node that's being involved. Rahu for north node eclipses and Ketu for south node eclipses. You can utilize something very similar in your own practice. If you are concerned about an eclipse that may be passing over where you live, the country that you live, or is configured to your birth chart in kind of a rough way, then those kinds of mantras or those kinds of like protective rituals, such as utilized by Pope Urban VIII, are probably good ideas to use. And those aren't exactly eclipse rituals, but rituals kind of surrounding the eclipse, or to protect yourself or propitiate the eclipse in some real way. And those are practices that I would generally think are good for people to utilize if they have those kinds of concerns. All in all, eclipses are really interesting spectacles, astrologically and astronomically, and they definitely represent energies that need to be respected and handled with care. They're not something to just kind of utilize willy-nilly, and they aren't really energies that you want to hold on to for very long periods of time if you decide that you need them for whatever reason. They kind of quickly go bad and kind of lash out in kind of like interesting and creative ways. Historically, eclipses have often been associated with reptile figures. You have kind of the Chinese and the Egyptian ideas that a dragon is swallowing the sun, and that imagery, that symbolism comes through a lot with kind of more toxic eclipse energy. You'll notice a lot of reptile energy if you have, like an eclipse talisman or, some kind of eclipse working that you've done. Reptiles tend to be drawn to it, snakes, lizards, especially in places that they're not usually seen. They can also kind of manifest as medical issues, and this can happen even without there being any real like magical connection or any kind of ritual work done. The eclipses, the sun and moon, are very heavily associated with the eyes, and so it's not uncommon to see individuals or occurrences of eye pain, styes, or other kind of eye concerned redness, inflammation happen around or close to eclipses, either on the day or the day after. And another medical association with eclipses that I didn't really even think about until more recently, as I've kind of been bombarded with occurrences of it, are seizures. Either kind of the intensification of a pre-existing seizure disorder during the time of the eclipses, or the onset of a seizure disorder, or maybe even somebody who doesn't, go on to develop or be diagnosed with a seizure disorder per se, but just kind of has like a one-off seizure kind of during the eclipse or, in the time frame surrounding the eclipse, is another thing to consider, as the sun and moon are both associated with the brain, and especially the moon in traditional astrology is associated with, from a medical standpoint, is associated with seizure disorders, especially epilepsy, but any general seizure disorder as well. So that's something that you might expect to see a little bit more with lunar eclipses than solar eclipses. So all of that to say that eclipses don't really embody kind of healthy energy, and it's important to stay away from it as much as you possibly can. There may be situations in life where eclipse magic is useful, especially if you're going to do something that's a little bit more offensive, but generally eclipses are not going to help you for achieving healthy, positive life goals. In a lot of ways, they will set you back and kind of poison it against you. Earlier, I made a reference to the monkey's paw in relation to eclipses, and I really think that short story and its plot is a great way to conceptualize eclipse magic especially. In the short story, a family receives the titular monkey's paw from a friend who served in the British Army in India, and the monkey's paw is said to grant 3 wishes to its owner. The family make their wishes, and the wishes all come true, but there is always some heavy consequence associated with their gains, basically poisoning them and making the family regret the wishes that they make. This is a really great way to think about eclipse talismans and eclipse magic. There's always some sort of toxicity or poison involved with it, to where you might initially enjoy the results, but something is going to be off with it, that something isn't quite right, and it doesn't work out the way that you initially planned. So your best bet is just to do nothing, or to do, the Rahu Ketu mantras, or do some other sort of ritual that's associated with letting go and purging, if you feel like you must do anything at all. So everyone take care, stay safe, be healthy, and I'll see everyone again on the Capricorn full moon, which will be our final eclipse in this series.